All right, we've got another member segment this week. I'm here with member Andrew Fagal, who is a PhD in early American history and has studied quite a lot of the early American firearms as well. Welcome to the show, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about your background for the listeners who don't know you?
Yeah, so I went to graduate school after college to study early American history. And in the process of doing so, this is late 20 aughts, discovered that the field of firearms in early American history was generally understudied. And I ended up writing a dissertation on the growth of the American arms industry between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. And from that, I've had a number of publications on that broad topic, mostly for academic audiences.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating, right? I mean, I feel like in academia, guns really are very understudied and treated as something that is synonymous with criminal activity, right? Like you get a lot of study of criminal use of firearms
Right.
and a lot of writing about that. It was very similar, of course, to how news media treats guns as well. But it's really looking at such a tiny piece of the puzzle that is guns in America, right? Because most guns are normal and normal people use guns, as Professor David Yamani has said, another guest we've had on previously. And there really is not a lot of focus in either news media or academia on the way people actually use guns, the history of guns. I mean, we had another member just recently who wrote a book on John Moses Browning, who was able to obtain primary documents, source material from his family, because there really hadn't been much actual historical inquiry into his life. This was for a book, for publication, but it's just kind of amazing how underserved that all really is in our academic institutions. So it's interesting to speak to someone like you who is actually doing that kind of work. What is some of the more interesting things that you've written about?
Well, so before I get to that, I mean, one of the reasons why I think that that's the case is that about 25 years ago, you probably remember this, there was a book called Arming America by a historian named Michael Belisles. And Belisles' thesis was that firearms in early American history were relatively rare. And it's only with the growth of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century that guns become part of American culture.
Interesting.
Writ large. The problem with that book, most historians accepted the argument, and it was really in a couple of different like law journals, National Review, where people started pointing out that, hey, some of the sources don't say what you're saying. And the book ended up being retracted it won the Bancroft Prize. That got retracted. He ended up resigning his position from Emory University over it. And it was a big academic scandal from the early 2000s. And I think part of that kind of, who wants to engage with that kind of argument and with that scholarship of a massive scandal within the last, 25 years that ended a career. And, so one of the things about that book is that he had, whether it was academic malfeasance or oversight, I don't know. But within the book itself, he had a lot of interesting ideas, like Native American gun culture in the 17th century. And it's only recently that scholars have gone back and it's like, yeah, Native Americans developed a very robust firearms culture almost as soon as there's contact with Europeans. And that develops over the course of the next 200 years, things like that. So at least for myself, I write mostly on what we might consider the military industrial complex in early America. I don't really say it that way.
So that's how a layman might understand it, right? Someone like
right,
me.
Right. So it's things like the Springfield and Harpers Ferry arsenals, DuPont, which we think of as a major chemical corporation now, actually started as a gunpowder firm to make black powder for the federal government. because all the other competitors in the country were using literally mortar and pestle worked by hand to make black powder for these massive contracts. And they decided we're going to mechanize the process, things like that.
That's amazing. That's really incredible. I mean, I think there's a lot of history there that just kind of goes unexplored to a large degree. I mean, I suppose you gave sort of an interesting explanation for why that might be in recent history, but you know, and certainly, obviously, people get sort of pop history is driven by big events like the American Revolution or, you know, the big wars. You know, World War II is still extremely popular for history documentaries and so forth. But you know, there's so much interesting stuff in those spaces in that time period, and in how it really affected the development and growth of the United States, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my own particular take on it is, how does the United States go from this country in 1775 that's largely dependent upon foreign sources of arms and munitions to make its revolution actually work, to self-sufficiency and an exporter by the War of 1812 period. And, it ends up being that it's a real political problem that's addressed everywhere from the federal level all the way on down to local level, state and local levels, to try to bolster American arms manufacturing in the country. So yeah, it's a huge story of what governments were actually doing in this time period when we think of the federal government not really doing all that much.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually, it appears that you have one of these firearms from that period behind you. Is that right?
Yeah, that was. I bought this as a present for myself a couple of years ago from. I got it on auction at the Rock Island Armory. It's a model 1798 Eli Whitney musket, probably delivered to the federal government sometime in 1806. If I understand the way the brass band works on this correctly.
Fascinating. And so, what? I guess that's War of 1812 era.
Yeah, War of 1812 era, early Republic. I mean, with Eli Whitney, if people think of him today, it's cotton gin,
right?
Which is one of the most important inventions in American history, in terms of basically expanding the institution of slavery across the West. But Whitney did not make much money from that because it was a relatively simple design that anyone could just copy and not have to pay the patent rights. He made his money making muskets for the federal government.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where there's all these little interesting facts throughout American history, and when you're dealing with firearms, I think people just don't know or remember anymore. That sort of reminds me of the ghost gun that I bought a while back from my local store. That was a Sears model semi-automatic shotgun. I don't think most people who are under 40 today would know that was such a thing. You could mail order shotguns from Sears, and obviously going even further back, someone as famous as Eli Whitney, who's world renowned for inventing the cotton gin. Most people would not know that he had an arms company that sold guns to the federal government. So, it's pretty amazing the way that firearms are intertwined with really all sorts of major American institutions and people throughout history.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you've, this reminds me a lot too of when we had Ian McCollum from Forgotten Weapons on, right? He's very into the history of firearms, although it seems like you go perhaps an era further back than he does in a lot of his stuff.
I mean, my one claim to fame is that Ian McCollum based his video on the Chambers machine gun off of an article I wrote on the history of it. So that's like, I wrote something that someone popularized on YouTube, has 500,000 views. Most academics are happy if 10 people read their article.
Right. Can you give us a quick rundown of what the Chambers machine gun is?
So this was what's described as a superimposed load firearm. where the general idea is if you have a barrel, instead of just having one bullet at the back of it firing out, you'd have a number of bullets with black powder charges spaced out. And you'd fire from the front, bullet would leave, and then the next chamber in the round would be ignited. That would go out kind of like a Roman candle.
Yeah.
And people had been experimenting with superimposed loads ever since the early history of firearms. And so what this was, Chambers, he probably worked with this guy named Joseph Belton in Pennsylvania during the American Revolution, where they were trying to introduce this idea of let's outfit people with these superimposed load firearms in the Revolution. That really doesn't get anywhere. Chambers brings this idea up again in the early 1790s, and it's in the War of 1812 that the U.S. Navy actually adopts some of his weapons. One of which, it looks like a Gatling gun. It's like 7 barrels. Each one is loaded with some 40 to 50 shots.
Wow.
And the idea was that this thing was going to start firing, and it's going to go for a couple of minutes until it fires all of its bullets. The problem with this, as you might imagine, is that there's a lot that can go wrong in, I think it's 224 shots in one of these things.
Right.
So there's reports at the time of these guns, probably more dangerous to the user than to the person standing in front.
Yeah,
but when they work great.
I bet. I mean, it sounds like what it sounds like to me is when a round gets stuck in the barrel of a gun, you just keep putting more rounds behind it. It sounds like a pipe bomb.
Yeah, exactly. There's one of the reports I have is there's these the British capture a couple of examples from the Navy on the Great Lakes, and someone tries to load and fire it, and there's the newspaper account of his arm getting blown off when he tries to shoot at. So, kind of horrible stuff. But there's also the reports of some of the demonstrations under controlled circumstances, where apparently the French ambassador to the United States, we're going to order these right away. These are amazing. Let's get them to Napoleon. One condition: under no circumstances can you sell it to the Russians. Things like that.
Well, it could use that rule again today, I suppose. But I mean, this is another thing about guns is the other aspect of why so many people are interested in firearms is this mechanical aspect, the development history of firearms. It's all very fascinating. Similar reasons why people are into cars or any number of other things, architecture, something along those lines. And it's another area that just doesn't get talked about a lot, and that's why something like what Ian is doing is so popular.
Right.
But so how did you come across the Reload? What's your story there for becoming a member?
Yeah, I mean a couple of things. I think I came across you on social media at one point in time, right when the site was first being launched. And I think I ended up signing up sometime in the summer of 2021, right after the hard launch.
Nice.
And at least for why I did it, I mean, most of the reporting on firearms that was out there tended to be from one extreme or the other. And, I think guns are really important for understanding American history. And I think that they're also really important for understanding our own contemporary world that we live in. And so, well, I think it's perfectly fine. And I mean, I have my own biases and that we all do. It's the importance of being dispassionate and trying to present all sides and have conversations with all sorts of people that was, shall we say, sorely missing in a lot of online reporting on firearms and even in print reporting. So, that's the thing that I like the most about the Reload.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of what we try to do. I mean, this episode of the podcast, we've got Radley Balco from the Washington Post, who's a unique perspective. He's not necessarily somebody you're going to find on a lot of gun podcasts.
He's great. Yeah, Rise of the Warrior Cop and the County Dentist. on the bite mark evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that book is phenomenal.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we try to bring in all kinds of different voices. We've had people from gun control groups. We've had people from gun rights groups. We've had all sorts of advocates. I tried mostly to bring on experts who can speak to whatever's, in the news at the time. But yeah, I just think it's important to be informed and be fair and serious when you're talking about this subject, because it's something that affects really everyone in the country, even if you're not a gun owner. And, we now have surveys that show 46% of Americans report having a gun in the home. That's the latest number out of the University of Chicago. But, even if you're not one of those people, you're likely affected in some way by firearms, and even just by living in the United States, as you have discussed here on this segment of the show. Like it was an important part of the historical development of this country too. And it's something that rarely gets looked at as in a light this way, like from the perspective that we're trying to do. And that's why I thought it was important to found the Reload. And I'm glad that it's something other people value as well.